based on your respective experience, and please come in on this too, David, if you wish, what do you think the steps are that take a good proposal, a proposal that's going to improve the environment for specifically for walkers and footpath users, but also for everybody else, for people? What are the steps that make it most likely that a good plan will be able to get community support and be realised in the environment of a particular place?
I can start off, Kaz, and you can follow up as you afterwards. I think for us in Wellington, Wellington is a walking city, and we are really aware of trying to make sure that our walking environments are good. However, we do have some areas where it's very congested, for example, the Golden Mile. And I think one of the reasons that the Golden Mile, as we're planning for it to be formed in the future, has ended in the option which had most walking space reallocated, is because of partly advocacy, which I do think is very, very helpful, but also data. So Kaz touched on this, but we're getting much better at making sure that we're investigating, understanding the data. And understanding the data, it's not just about number of people walking, but the Golden Mile, for example, also who is shopping at those shops? How do people get there? What makes, so both the quantitative and the qualitative data that we're trying to get around these things. We've also got data around, people, brain activation. How often do you need different types of facades to ensure that people have an interesting walking route? What makes people choose to walk down Cuba Street instead of Taranaki Street, even though it adds an extra 3 minutes to their walking journey? We've done some research here at Wellington City Council around that, and have done some guidelines which NZTA have now adopted, some of our staff here. So there's a whole lot of that, but I think really that having a really good evidence base and understanding it from a multitude of directions and a multitude of different user groups, and the 8 to 80 that Kaz talks about, is really important.
The one other thing I might add to that is, I guess, like, telling stories is really important, and I think celebrating is one of the key ways to do that. Often, human nature is like we critique everything, right? So we almost need to flip that around sometimes and kind of go, well, what is the stuff that is actually working well, and celebrate that stuff and share that. But I also think about talking about those negative stories, so to speak, when something isn't quite good, because I think about all the levers that you can kind of pull, and I often think that when we get political interest around, say, our footpaths, well, particularly in my area, like, I often think I only hear from some of our political leaders around footpaths when something goes wrong, because they recognise all of a sudden that it's an issue, and we often don't talk about that. Whereas if everyone's complaining about congestion, that's the only issue that you often see as the problem. But obviously, I think that has to be coupled with some of the good things about walking and what you see and what you enjoy as well, because I think if it's only tarnished with a negative sort of brush, that can also be unhelpful. So it's kind of finding the stories and knowing which ones to elevate in a positive way. So, often when I see our young tamariki and rangatahi moving about on foot, that's really cool, because even doing like a walking audit recently with some of the students at Wilford School down Jackson Street, some of them had never walked the whole street before, and it's couple of blocks away from them, and I just thought, this is incredible. And even the insights that they had were so telling of some of our challenges, and often again we don't allow young people to be part of that conversation, and I think in some ways that's kind of like a golden place where we can start some of those conversations, because young people, and I say this with a youth worker hat on in some ways, that young people, when you start to connect with them, you're creating that present change, you're impacting their whānau, because what's going to happen is they'll go home and tell their parents what they did that day, and it gets them thinking a bit differently. But also, that starts to feed them into that conversation around what their future could be and how they can be part of that story and weaving of how things will turn out. And I often think that's kind of where we can do some great work around bringing more into that story.
Sure. Thank you for that. So the next question is from Celia. This is for anybody who wishes to answer from the panel. How will you measure current walking, including children and wheelchair users, and analyse changes over months and years? So perhaps, David, do you want to start on that one if you've got any comment on it?
Yeah, that's definitely a work on for us. I mean, I think a lot of the change we have driven in the last few years has been, and consistent with my presentation, has been on the in terms of the private space. But we are, we've had some significant change internally, and we're starting to see some change in terms of how we manage our own assets and our transport network to support that change in the urban development. But yeah, that's probably still a work on for us. I mean, I think we've got a number of projects underway, which I think will take us in that direction. And we've had some innovative street projects through Waka Kotahi, but consistent with the earlier speakers and the focus on data. Yeah, I think data is critical, and that's a work on for us.
Vida or Kaz, do you want to come in on that one?
So in terms of data collection, we have our quantum counts, which you also probably know have been doing them for 20 years now. So each March we do a week of counting about how people come into the city. One of the things we're also wanting to do going forward is to include micromobility as a separate transport mode. So that's cycling, walking. We get, of course, public transport data as well, and then also some of our parking counts. And we've steadily seen that walking is the preferred, as Sarah was talking about. 20% of Wellingtonians do walk to work and into the city. But I think, and I hope that we can also increase that. So it's also looking at those nodal points of quite often it's not the first kilometre or the last kilometre. There's some pretty tricky spots as you come in. One, for example, is at the bottom of the Brooklyn Hill. It's really hard as both a cyclist and a pedestrian to navigate how you get through that not very nice environment for active modes. So those are some of the things we're going to be focusing on. In terms of, as I talked about, we've got Tim Young helping us doing accessibility audit. I also think, I grew up in I had my children in a city, didn't own a car and got round, and I actually preferred using public transport and walking than driving with small children, because you can have quality time with them, and you can also you can walk and you can talk, and there's much better possibilities than if you're having to focus on driving and getting angry at other cars. So I think actually walking, if we can promote as well that as a preferred mode, and it's not actually more difficult for mothers and prams. And I had twins, so I had one of those really big prams that annoyed everyone else on the footpath. So yeah.
So I might, Kaz, now Ellen, I know you have a question, but there's two questions specifically to you. So I might put those to you, and then we'll close with Ellen's question and thanking our speakers, of course. So two questions here to you, Kaz. One from Andy, parking. Tips on how to introduce reduced parking and community reactions. And two, from Delia, what aspects wasn't successful in the Innovating Streets project on Jackson Street? Tough questions, I know.
Yeah, they are. I think they're actually, those two questions probably weave into each other in many ways. So I might even start with Delia's question around that. So a huge part of the resistance we had was around car parking. So we've got our business association who, not everyone on it, but I think there's a huge voice around it that really value car parks. And historically that's kind of sat there for quite some time. I won't dive too deep into that because I guess it's very political, but for a lot of people, the correlation of car parks equals business is what's in their head. And I think, again, some of that is just based on just their recent experience. Some of that is stuff they've probably learnt in a certain capacity. But I think we also don't have much culture around showing alternatives in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I guess that's kind of why I was talking a little bit about the stats and facts around other options that have been done in other parts of the country to talk about that, or even in the city, because we don't really have that in Hutt City. And so part of that was the challenge, but I also think with our Innovating Streets corridor, we had some historical, I think, struggles as well. And some of that meant that I think we're in some ways already in the back foot sort of space trying to get that to move. And so that I think was part of the challenge. But I also think, to kind of start jumping into Andy's question, I think we need to, so although there needs to be conversations around reducing car parking or time limits or things like that, just talk about changes in general to socialise that, I think is really important. But you also need to have alternative means that allow for it to be feasible. So you can't just all of a sudden take away the car parks and assume nothing's going to go wrong, because obviously it will go wrong. But if we start to go, what is it that's stopping people from travelling on foot or biking or whatever first, and then actually start to work out what things can you do together. So one of the huge things that we learned when we started to unpick like what could change and how it could change, one of the questions that was asked around certain businesses was, how did you get into the shop and why? And what would change that? Would you and so a huge part of that actually came back to the fact that our footpaths were not great. So a lot of, say, like our elderly population who visited our shops often wouldn't want to walk multiple blocks because the footpaths were dangerous in essence. And actually, if we start to address that, we might see some changes. And I even get that sometimes when I'm in one of the shops that I work at and, someone's come over and they've asked for something and you go, oh, that's a couple of blocks over. And they're like, oh, that's too far away to walk. And, often that comes down to the footpaths and the environment that we created that isn't actually, I guess, encouraging people to get out there and walk. But, in many other spaces and places, we know actually the business benefits of actually someone walking past a window and then stopping and then actually going into that shop and purchasing something actually leads to other benefits. And I think trying to find those good stories that we can weave in, and also trying to recognise what things are the barriers. Let's deal with some of those, as well as let's see how we can change a few things. And in Petone, for instance, we've had some massive challenges around even having a conversation around paid parking. So currently, we've got 1 hour free parking, but how do we actually change the conversation to take away from that, to actually look at what is the concern around that? Because the concern for it is that many people will stop coming here, especially when we've got parking for hours. And so there's these kind of interesting dynamics that I think when we start to address what are the barriers as well as what are some of the solutions, and we put those things together, that's when I think we'll see some really good changes. But if one happens on its own siloed, it's not actually going to help solve the problem.
Thank you very much. It's really good to get that feedback on what happened. I'll say that also as a regular user of Jackson Street from a few years ago myself. Ellen has a question, so we'll take the question, then
I'll
close.
leap in. It ties in with what everybody's been saying. My question, I'm going to give a little bit of context, but my question is, how do groups such as ours, an advocacy group, help with some of this pushback? So I really admire your presentation, Kaz, because I know how much hard work has gone into Jackson Street, and you must be kind of disappointed that it didn't go with that lovely process. And I want to also thank Vida and Sarah very much. When they said they were working late last night, the meeting didn't finish until 9 o'clock, and then there would have been wrap up. So they're really knackered. It's been a really big process to get the spatial plan thing done. So thank you. And David, fantastic presentation. You said that you're getting professional bullying from people for some of your work. We don't see that as advocates. We kind of know some of it's going on, but it's not out in the open. So how can we as advocates, I mean, I sometimes think, oh, maybe I'm adding to some of this bullying pressure. So I really hope that we're not. How can we as advocates help you to do this fantastic work that you want to see and make some of the transformations that we need? Thank you.
I think in that case, a lot of it's about, I think, calling out our leaders and holding them to account. So a lot of the change that we're driving in Palmy, and there is a lot of work we're doing on the transport network as well as the urban development I talked about. But if you look at all the strategies and documents that the elected members have signed up to and signed off to, everything we're doing is entirely consistent with that. So we had a 1-hour debate in the council chambers a couple of weeks ago about removing 5 car parks on a city centre street. No one held the councillors to account around that decision and its alignment with council's strategic direction. So I think, it's, for me, holding our leaders to account about the things they've signed up to is the way community groups or advocacy groups can assist.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Can I just
very quickly, Vida?
Yeah. Because I do think that that's really important, but I'm also very proud of our councillors yesterday that did follow through on the strategic direction which they have asked us to progress our projects on. So I think it's very hopeful in Wellington, but I know what David's talking about. My staff quite often get a lot of personal attacks on them for the work they're doing, and it's really, really hard for them sometimes. But so your support, and when you do clap at when they are progressing things, it really means a lot to them. So yeah, keep on doing that.
Thank you. And on that note, let's clap quickly to thank our speakers. Then we'll take a short break before coming back at 11. Thank you so much, everybody.